Welcome to this week's edition of Ask an MS Expert. I'm Jon Strum, and I'm the host of the Real Talk MS podcast. Each week, Real Talk MS reaches thousands of people in more than 100 countries around the world with the news that people affected by MS need to know. My wife, Jean, lived with progressive MS for 23 years, so I've had a front row seat experiencing all the ways that MS can impact a family. I'm a past member of the International Progressive MS Alliance Scientific Steering Committee. Currently, I'm a district activist leader and trustee for the National MS Society, and I chair the Society's California Government Relations Advisory Committee. The MS Society's Ask an MS Expert webcast is designed to give us a place for the MS community to connect and to connect you with MS experts who are ready to answer your questions on the topics that impact people affected by MS every day. Please feel free to post your comments and questions on Facebook, YouTube, or Twitch. MS navigators are online throughout today's program, answering those questions and connecting you to resources. COVID-19 has impacted the way we work, the way we go to school, the way we socialize with friends and family. It's truly changed the way we live. And many of us, especially people who are affected by MS, are wondering about what may come next. Joining us today to talk about where we are as we transition from pandemic to endemic and what the future may hold for people living with MS is Dr. Nancy Sicotte. Dr. Sicotte is professor and chair of the Department of Neurology at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles. And Dr. Sicotte also chairs the MS Society's National Medical Advisory Committee, and she leads the MS Society's COVID-19 Advisory Group. Welcome back, Dr. Sicotte. Thanks for joining us today. I always feel a bit more reassured when you join us with an update.
Thank you. It's really a pleasure to be back again and to see you. And I feel like we're a little bit like Groundhog Day.
Well, for the past 2 years, COVID-19 has been anything but Groundhog Day, right? It's upended what many would call the normalcy of our daily lives. And experts seem to agree that this virus isn't going away anytime soon. But there's hope that the COVID-19 vaccines and new treatment options will help us move from pandemic to endemic. So to get us started, I'm hoping you'll explain the difference between a pandemic and an endemic.
So we've clearly been living through a pandemic. So that's when you have an infection that sweeps across the world and affects multiple places on the globe at the same time. We are moving toward endemic. I don't think we're quite there yet. So we still have many, many places across the world that are experiencing very high levels of infection with COVID. But what an endemic means is that an infection has localized outbreaks. And so I think we all were hoping at the beginning of the pandemic that it would be eliminated completely. And we could say the pandemic's over and that's the end and we won't have to worry about COVID-19 anymore. But it's very clear, as we've seen, wave after wave and variant after variant, that we're going to be living with this virus. And that means that it's going to be endemic in the population. So there'll be hotspots that will occur and flare up intermittently. And so I think what the endemic word tells us is that we have to learn how to live with the virus. And I think that's the phase we're in now, which is starting to think about how do we get back to a more normal kind of existence while we're still having to deal with the fact that the virus is here and with us.
Well, to your point, just weeks after most cities and states across the country rolled back their mask mandates and vaccine requirements, COVID-19 case numbers are rising again due to the Omicron subvariant BA.2. So what do we know about this subvariant so far?
So I think what we know, it's more infectious than the original Omicron variant. And I think this has been the case that we've seen. This is why it becomes dominant, because it's easier to catch. And so the virus has been mutating all along, and these variants that arise that are more catchy, easier to transmit, are the ones that are selected for. And so I would say the only silver lining is, while they do seem to be more transmissible, we have not seen them become more virulent, meaning they're not becoming more dangerous and causing severe disease. So there seems to be a little bit of a trade-off between easy to catch, but not causing as severe disease. Now, there may be other reasons why that's the case, in part because so many people have been vaccinated, that when they do get infected, their infections are moderated and they don't end up going to the hospital, and they thankfully we're not seeing the ICUs overflowing and so forth. But these new variants, and especially the BA2, is just 10% more transmissible than Omicron, which was 50% more transmissible than the one before, and so on and so forth.
At the most recent FDA meeting, there was discussion about the need to broaden the types of vaccines we have available instead of focusing on one variant at a time with a new or updated vaccine. How long would it take for that process to develop? And would broadening our vaccines mean that we'd be protected against all future variants?
Well, that would certainly be the hope, right? That we would come up with a sort of a global coronavirus vaccine. In order to do that, you have to be able to identify the key components of the virus that would be required to be there no matter what the variant was. And there are parts of the spike protein that sort of fit that bill, because the spike protein is how the virus attaches onto human cells and causes the infection. So you could imagine you could have a vaccine rather, that targeted some of these highly preserved pieces of the virus. The problem is the virus is very sneaky, very tricky, and a lot of these new variants that we're seeing have mutations in the spike protein for that reason, because of they're trying to escape. They're able to escape, to cause an infection, and get around the vaccines that we have already. So, but I have heard discussions about a sort of a global coronavirus vaccine that would protect us against this coronavirus and potentially future pandemic-causing viruses. So, how long will that take? Certainly several months, because you have to put together groups of patients. You have to, give them the vaccine and then collect the data. I guess the good news is that there's still so much transmission that some of these studies that in the past would have taken years and years, we have vaccine trials that have been completed in mere months. So I do think we're probably heading toward a situation where we would have an annual vaccine, kind of like we do for the flu. But it would sure be nice if it was one that was really covered all the bases for coronaviruses in the future.
Well, we know that the COVID-19 vaccines that have been approved here in the US are safe for people with MS, and hopefully everyone with MS has gotten the message that they should get vaccinated. But we also know that certain disease-modifying therapies may prevent some individuals from mounting an adequate immune response. So, Dr. Sicotte, what DMTs are we talking about here, and what does this mean for the people who take them?
So it's a great point, and we spent a lot of time in our committee talking about developing advice for people, gathering the data that has been developed, which has been very helpful, in getting the message across. So what we've learned, a few surprises, but what we've learned is that some of the medications that work very well at preventing MS also lead to a less than robust vaccination response. And that's the class of medications we call B-cell depleters. So that includes rituximab, ocrelizumab, and now ofatumumab. And those names, the brand names are Ocrevus, Rituxan, and Kesimpta. So those are medications that when you take them, they're monoclonal antibodies that deplete B cells, and B cells are one part of the immune response that eventually lead to antibody production. So it was not surprising to us that people on these medications didn't make as many of the neutralizing antibodies as you would normally if you weren't on those drugs. And the neutralizing antibodies are sort of the first line of defense against infection. But I think it's important to recognize that there's a second line of defense called the T cells. And what we have learned is when people are on B cell depleters, the T cells are still responding. So even though you may not see the neutralizing antibodies, there is still protection from the vaccine. The other group of medications that were shown to have less than robust responses are the S1P inhibitors. Those are things like fingolimod and pasanamod and so on. There's about 3 or 4 of them now on the market. Those also, because they sequester both T cells and B cells in lymph nodes, the vaccine is not able to get in there and form an antibody response. But even though we have seen that with some of these medications, we still feel that individuals who are on them should be vaccinated and should get the additional baseline dosing. So 3 shots for their initial vaccination regimen, then followed by the boosters. And we've seen over and over again that people who are vaccinated, even when they're on these medications, for the most part are protected against severe disease and hospitalization. So it's absolutely worthwhile, even if you're on those 2 classes of medications.
So I think you just mentioned something that probably bears highlighting a little bit. For people who are immunocompromised and 12 years old and older, the National MS Society guidance is that they should get a total of 5 doses if they initially received one of the mRNA vaccines, the Pfizer or Moderna vaccine. Is that right?
That's correct. So unlike individuals who are not immunocompromised, if you are on one of these medications, your initial vaccination regimen is 3 doses, and those would be 3 to 4 weeks apart. So you'd have 3 doses, and then that's your first baseline vaccination. And then you would be eligible for boosters after that at 4 months. And now so that would be a total of 4 shots, but now we're on to our 5th booster for individuals like that. So you could have had 5 doses up at this point for people with the mRNA vaccines who are immunocompromised.
I also noticed that the MS Society now recommends an mRNA vaccine over the Johnson & Johnson vaccine for people who are living with MS. Why did that part of the guidance change?
So that came from some data that we got. So first of all, the J&J vaccines, it turns out they do provide good protection and overall are safe, but there were some evidence, some incidents of blood clotting, in particular among young women. And because our MS population includes many young women, that was one of the concerns that since we have these mRNA vaccines that are also very effective. And then secondly, for the boosters, it turns out that if you've had a J&J vaccine and you get an mRNA booster, you get a bigger response. So the advice now is just based on real world data that became available throughout the course of the pandemic. So I just want to highlight that. I think sometimes people get frustrated or confused when advice changes or something that we said previously now is different than what it was at the very beginning. But this is because this is science in real time, right? We're building this plane as we're flying it, sort of. But as we get new information, this helps us to develop guidance, and some of it is we don't know until we get real world experience and collect the data, and then we're able to update our advice.
COVID-19 vaccines are the best first defense against becoming infected, but now there are medications available to treat COVID-19 and to use before and after you're exposed to COVID-19. So let's talk about some of those for a few minutes. Can you tell us what a monoclonal antibody treatment is?
Yeah, so I think our MS patients are familiar with monoclonal antibodies because we use them to treat the disease, as I was saying. So a monoclonal antibody is just an individual protein that is exactly the same. A whole group of them are manufactured, and they are very specific in their effect. And so they're kind of like smart bombs is the way I explain it to my patients. So they've developed treatments against COVID-19, against the SARS-CoV-2 virus in order to prevent severe disease when people are infected. And these infusions are typically done within the first 5 days of infection and can be very beneficial in preventing severe disease. So what's interesting is some of these have now been, with the new variants, have been shown not to be as effective. So we previously talked about sotrovimab as a drug that is a monoclonal antibody that was given as a 1-dose infusion, but it turns out that it's not effective against the Omicron variants. So that one's been taken off the market. Same with Regeneron is not recommended for treatment, but there is some other antivirals such as remdesivir, which is still used for people who are hospitalized with severe COVID. And what's been also another oral medication, which is an antiviral, is molnupiravir, and one that seems to be very effective as an antiviral, not a monoclonal, is Paxlovid. So which is an oral therapy. So we have a variety of options for patients who, should they become infected with COVID and have symptoms, especially if they may be immunocompromised, these therapies should be utilized, and they are available to anyone who has initially been diagnosed with COVID. So I really highly recommend for any of your listeners who are in that immunocompromised group, if they do become ill with COVID, that they contact their primary care doctors or their neurologists and get access to these medications. So this is the good news about being able to actually manage infection. So to make people feel a little more confident that even if the worst happened and they got infected, that they would be able to ride out the infection without having to go to the hospital and get sick. So to your other point about protecting people before they get exposed, yes. This is an area where I think we have to do a lot of education because there is a monoclonal antibody called Evusheld. It's actually 2 different monoclonal antibodies that have been developed. And what's exciting about this is to prevent you from getting infected. So it's pre-exposure prophylaxis or PrEP. And so for individuals who live with MS, who are immunocompromised, who are worried about their vaccine responses, this is a really nice additional protective choice for them. And we have offered this to all of our patients who are on the B-cell depleters or on the S1P inhibitors, for example. So it's a shot that you get one in each arm because they're 2 different monoclonal antibodies. And what's really nice is it gives you protection for up to 6 months against getting infected. So it's as though you're getting those neutralizing antibodies that you weren't able to form because you were on these B-cell depleters. And I just want to emphasize for folks that you should consider getting this treatment so that now that people are out and about again without their masks on and so forth, this is another layer of protection to help you feel more confident as you re-engage with the world.
I want to circle back to that scenario in just a moment, but getting back to Evusheld for a second, how does someone access Evusheld? Where do they go?
That's a great question. So the supplies have been limited, and especially when they first rolled it out. And there is a process. We want to make sure that the right people who are eligible for the drug are actually getting it. So each institution is a little bit different, but the guidance from the FDA is certain groups of individuals should be eligible for this, people who've had cancer and transplants and such. But the process should be discussed with your neurologist. And here at Cedars, we put in a request to our pharmacy. They go through and review the chart. And then when they approve it, then they let the patients know and they go to an injection center and get the injections done there. I will make one point, though, that's very important. You will not be eligible for Evusheld unless you've completed your vaccinations already. So we don't want this to be a replacement for vaccination. This is an add-on to people who are vaccinated. The only exception would be someone who has had an allergic or life-threatening reaction to their vaccine. they would be, and I just saw a patient like this in my clinic, they are eligible for Evusheld if they're not able to get any more vaccines. But otherwise, you have to complete your baseline, your initial vaccination and booster in order to be eligible for Evusheld.
That's an important detail. I want to circle back now to something you just mentioned a moment ago. We're seeing this shift in how people are thinking about COVID-19. It's starting to be considered a part of everyday life instead of something requiring lockdowns and strict preventive measures. How will this shift in public mindset and in public policy impact people who are immunocompromised? I heard from Lila, who says she's immunocompromised. She's still living like the pandemic just started, and she's wondering how long she has to remain vigilant and careful.
So, John, it's really a hard question to give an absolute answer, but I would say that there are pieces of data that we have that should give people living with MS or other immunocompromised conditions some solace. And that is, we do know that the vaccines provide protection against severe disease. We do know that there are these therapies that are available now should you get infected. And then also the even being protected before you get infected. The other thing I will say is that we have seen, for the most part, even in individuals who are immunocompromised with these new variants, the disease is very mild. And so I think the things that we want to be vigilant for, if you're living in this situation, you want to look around your local area and see what the transmission rates are. And probably the best data is going to be coming from the sewage analysis, which I'm sure you've been reading about. And that's in part because I know a lot of people who've been positive, COVID positive, but they didn't have a PCR, they did a home test. So I think the numbers that we're seeing from public health is being sort of underestimated. So you want to look at the local hospitalization rates. That's going to tell you how much virus is out there in your community. And if it's really spiking, you probably don't want to be going out and about. Secondly, masks are very, very helpful, and they offer another layer of protection. I know I'm going to continue to wear my mask wherever I go when there's other people around, and especially indoors. So those are some things that that people who are living in this situation can do to feel a little bit safer.
Well, I think you may have just answered what I was about to ask, but I'm going to go ahead and put it out there anyway, because some of this is so important, it bears repeating. You know, I keep thinking that you and I have to stop meeting this way.
Yeah.
but
Talk about something else one time, John, right?
Right, but these updates are just so important and so timely. So I'm wondering if you could share the top 3 takeaways that you'd like our viewers to remember.
Well, my first takeaway is always the same, and that is get vaccinated if you're not vaccinated. And now that you have another reason to do it, it will allow you to have access to this protective pre-exposure treatment with Evusheld. Number 2, if you do get sick, contact your primary care doctor and get access to these therapies so that you won't end up with a severe infection. And then also consider getting the Evusheld if you're on those medications and are eligible. And then number 3 is, I think it is time for us to start going back out into the world and balancing risk and benefit. We have to recognize that individuals who've been locked up for 2 years suffer psychological and health impacts of not being out with people, not socializing, and not living their lives to the fullest, which is our goal in the when we're taking care of people living with MS. So I think we need to start building confidence and building, getting out there and getting more engaged in safe activities, but don't throw away your mask yet.
Well, thank you for sharing your expertise. I think we have time for 1 or 2 more questions. Sam asked if there's any research being done currently to make the vaccines more effective for immunocompromised people.
So that's a great question. I am not aware of any specific studies, but there are things that can be done when people are vaccinated, like giving adjuvants, like giving a little extra boost to the vaccine. We have also given advice about timing, so you can increase the effectiveness of the vaccines if you're on one of these disease-modifying therapies by having it at the right schedule. But that's probably the extent of that. I'm sure there are people who are looking at ways to promote longer lasting immune responses, for example.
We have a question from Brianna, and Brianna is wondering whether she should get an antibody test to see if she's developed an immune response.
So it's a great question. Of course, I would encourage anyone who wants to know to take part in a research study. So here at Cedars, we have a study that was the Corral study, now the Embark study, where all of us are getting our blood drawn and testing for antibodies. So I would say in that context, it's a win-win, because we're all kind of curious to know, do we have antibodies or not? But the truth is, they're not really used for clinical decision-making. And it doesn't mean that you're either not protected at all or protected. So it really doesn't help in clinical decision-making, as I said. As I was talking about before, there's two lines of defense. The neutralizing antibodies is only one of them. And we know even people who are vaccinated and boosted, who presumably have a fair amount of neutralizing antibody, can still get infected. But what's really important is because they're vaccinated, they have those T cell responses, so they don't get very sick. So in the future, I was just reading about how we have a lack of information about T cell responses. Those aren't commercially available or easy to do. Those are longer, more difficult tests. That might be the sort of important, but right now I would say it's more curiosity and not really helpful from a clinical standpoint.
Well, I want to thank everyone who submitted your questions today, and thanks for being with us, Dr. Sicotte.
Always a pleasure, John. Thank you so much.
Before we close, I want to remind you that the National MS Society's MS Navigator team is your best partner when it comes to connecting you to the very best information and resources on living with MS. You can reach an MS Navigator by phone, email, or through the Society's website by chat. For information and resources on MS, please visit the Society's website. You'll find research updates and news, information on connection programs like self-help groups and MS Friends, ways to get involved, and you'll find out about upcoming events that are taking place near you. Remember, you can connect with the National MS Society and others affected by MS on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and LinkedIn. And I hope you'll join me every week on the Real Talk MS podcast, where I continue the conversation that we start here. You'll find Real Talk MS at realtalkms.com, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, or wherever you find your favorite podcasts. I'd like to thank Dr. Sicotte for joining us today. Please remember that a recording of this webcast will be available at the Society's website at nationalmssociety.org/MSexpert, as well as on Facebook and YouTube. I hope you'll join us at this same time for next week's edition of Ask an MS Expert. You can always find out our upcoming program topics on the National MS Society's website. And now, I have a favor to ask each of you. Getting your feedback on today's webinar is important. So if you're watching on Facebook Live, you'll see a link to a survey pinned to the comments section. And on YouTube, you'll find that link in the program description. Completing the survey makes a real difference. The information you provide helps us continuously improve, and it helps shape future programs. The survey takes just 1 minute, so I hope you'll take a minute to fill it out. On behalf of Dr. Nancy Sicotte and the National MS Society, I want to thank you once again for joining us. Please stay safe and make healthy choices.